Do we have to accept our limits? Sometimes the things we most want to do are the hardest to accomplish. It can be discouraging to discover our limits and frustrating to find ourselves facing unexpected challenges. Fortunately, many serious obstacles can be overcome with creativity and determination. In this excerpt from The Story of My Life, Helen Keller describes triumphing, over her limitations. If you direct your attention to the top, we have what's called a text analysis of an autobiography. Let's follow as Mrs. Lee reads the description of an autobiography. The most personal kind of nonfiction writing is autobiography, a writer's account of his or her own life. In biographies, the subject is a person other than the writer. In autobiographies, the writer is the subject. Now keep in mind, auto means self, bio means life. So if you're writing an autobiography, then you're writing a story about yourself. Autobiographies, let's look at the bullets. Autobiographies are told from the first person point of view using first person pronouns. And of course you see I, me, we, us, our, my, and mine. Autobiographies include literary language and devices to provide descriptions of people and events that have influenced the writer. Autobiographies share the writer's personal thoughts and feelings about his or her experiences. As you read The Story of My Life, think about the information the author decides to include about herself. Also keep in mind, this is a great example of personal reflective narrative, and you're going to see Helen Keller really have to dig deep, and she really needs to express a lot of things about herself that maybe she doesn't want to remember or think about, but they're truly a part of who she is and how she was able to not accept her limits. In this reflection, in this actual excerpt of The Story of My Life, please pay attention to the sensory details Helen Keller uses to describe the setting and describe the situation. The Story of My Life, Helen Keller. And please note above Helen Keller, you can see the Braille writing. So The Story of My Life, Helen Keller. The most important day I remember in all my life is the one on which my teacher, Anne Mansfield Sullivan, came to me. I am filled with wonder when I consider the immeasurable contrast between the two lives which it connects. It was the 3rd of March, 1887, 3 months before I was 7 years old. On the afternoon of that eventful day, I stood on the porch, dumb, expectant. I guessed vaguely, for my mother's signs, and from the hurrying to and fro in the house, that something unusual was about to happen. So you can notice that she can tell by the hurrying, by the way the floor is being pressed. She can feel vibrations, and that's how she knows that there's lots of rush in the house. Isn't that amazing? So she's using how the touch of the floor and the people around her, that tells senses for her. I'm going to go back to that sentence, I guess vaguely. I guess vaguely from my mother's signs and from the hurrying to and fro in the house that something unusual was about to happen. So I went to the door and waited on the steps. The afternoon sun penetrated the mass of honeysuckle that covered the porch and fell on my upturned face. My fingers lingered almost unconsciously on the familiar leaves and blossoms which had just come forth to greet the sweet southern spring. So she's using her sense of touch and how the sun touched her face. I did not know what the future held of marvel or surprise for me. Anger and bitterness had preyed upon me continually for weeks, and a deep languor had succeeded this passionate struggle. Have you ever been at sea in a dense fog when it seemed as if a tangible, so something you can touch, a tangible white darkness shut you in, and the great ship tense? And here is a picture of Helen and her teacher, Anne Sullivan. And you can notice Helen as a young child, and she has her hand on her teacher's face. And as we read more and more about Helen, we'll find out what she's actually doing when she touches her teacher's face, her teacher's throat, and her teacher's mouth, what she's learning to do. Helen was describing this great ship that was out in this great white fog, and how you were nervous and starting with anxious, groped her way toward the shore with plummet and sounding line, and you waited with beating heart for something to happen. I was like that ship before my education began. Only I was without compass or sounding line and had no way of knowing how near the harbor was. So she's used this great metaphor to describe her existence before she had an education, her existence before she learned how to use all of her senses to activate some of her limitations she thought she would never be able to use. Light, give me light, was the wordless cry of my soul, and the light of love shone on me in that very hour. I felt approaching footsteps. I stretched out my hand as I supposed to my mother. Someone took it, and I was caught up and held close in the arms of her who had come to reveal all things to me, and more than all things else, to love me. The morning after my teacher came, she led me into her room and gave me a doll. The little blind children at the Perkins Institute had sent it, and Laura Bridgman had dressed it, but I did not know this until afterward. When I had played with it a little while, Miss Sullivan slowly spelled into my hand the word D-O-L-L, doll. I was at once interested in this finger play and tried to imitate it. When I finally succeeded in making the letters correctly, I was flushed with childish pleasure and pride. Running downstairs to my mother, I held up my hand and made the letters for doll. I did not know that I was spelling a word, or even that words existed. I was simply making my fingers go in monkey-like imitation. So she didn't know she was reading. She didn't know she was spelling. All she knew is she was mimicking what Mrs. Sullivan had shown her. In the days that followed, I learned to spell in this uncomprehending way a great many words, among them pen, hat, cup, and a few verbs like sit, stand, and walk. But my teacher had been with me several weeks before I understood that everything has a name. One day, while I was playing with my new doll, Miss Sullivan put my big rag doll into my lap, also spelled D-O-L-L, and tried to make me understand that D-O-L-L, doll, applied to both. Earlier in the day, we had had a tussle over the words mug, M-U-G, and water, W-A-T-E-R. Miss Sullivan had tried to impress it upon me that mug, M-U-G, is mug, and that W-A-T-E-R is water. But I persisted in confounding the two. In despair, she had dropped the subject for the time, only to renew it at the first opportunity. I became impatient At the repeated attempts in seizing the new doll, I dashed it upon the floor. I was keenly delighted when I felt the fragments of the broken doll at my feet. Neither sorrow nor regret followed my passionate outburst. I had not loved the doll. In the still dark world in which I lived, there was no strong sentiment or tenderness. I felt my teacher sweep the fragments to one side of the hearth, and I had a sense of satisfaction that the cause of my discomfort was removed. She brought me a hat, and I knew I was going out into the warm sunshine. So that hat let her know that she was going outside. So that's a good way for us as writers, without saying, hey, we're going outside, hey, without saying it's a warm day, or know that it's a sunny day. She knew it was a sunny day just merely by knowing she was getting a hat. I'll start again with the top sentence that start with she brought. She brought me my hat, and I knew I was going out into the warm sunshine. This thought, if a wordless sensation may be called a thought, made me hop and skip with pleasure. We walked down the path to the well house, attracted by the fragrance of the honeysuckle with which it was covered. Someone was drawing water, and my teacher placed my hand under the spout. As the cool stream gushed over one hand, she spelled into the other the word water, first slowly, then rapidly. I stood still with my whole attention fixed upon the motion of her fingers. Suddenly I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that water meant the wonderful cool something that was flowing over my hand. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, set it free. There were barriers still, it is true, but barriers that could, in time, be swept away. I left the well house eager to learn. Everything had a name, and each name gave birth to a new thought. As we returned to the house, every object which I touched seemed to quiver with life. That was because I saw everything with the strange new sight that had come to me. So the sight of touch, and then the words matching the sight of touch, gave her sight. On entering the door, I remembered the doll I had broken. I felt my way to the hearth and picked up the pieces. So now that she had begun to learn to communicate, she started to feel remorse for that doll. I tried vainly, so without merit, I tried vainly to put them together. Then my eyes filled with tears, for I realized what I had done, and for the first time I felt repentance and sorrow. I learned a great many new words that day. I do not remember what they all were, but I do know that mother, father, sister, teacher were among them. Words that were to make the world blossom for me. Like Aaron's rod with flowers, it would have been difficult to find a happier child than I was as I lay in my crib at the close of that eventful day and lived over the joys it had brought me, and for the first time longed for a new day to come. I just want to go over and talk about some of these questions that are on the back of the story that you would find in your lit book, just to kind of make you think about these things so that it will help you with your posting on tonight's homework. Of course, we have some basic comprehension questions. How does Helen know that something unusual is happening on the day Anne Sullivan arrives? What is the first word Sullivan tries to teach Keller? How does Keller's world change once she begins to understand the connection between language and meaning? And I think that's a substantial question. Okay, go down to 5 where it says identify sensory details. And it says, although Keller lacked the sense of sight and hearing. Okay, let's go back to number 5 where it says identify sensory details. Although Keller lacked the senses of sight and hearing, she was able to observe many things using her remaining senses. And of course, they're showing a graphic organizer where touch, of course, we had the wonderful cool something on line 76. And of course, smell, we talked about different things in the story as well. Okay, number 6, where it talks about analyzing autobiography. Consider what Keller shares about her experiences. How would the story of Keller's life be different if Anne Sullivan had written it? And a matter of fact, we're going to see the same account of Helen learning the word water, and we're going to see it from Anne Sullivan's point of view later in the week. And then at the very bottom of the page, do we have to accept our limits? How was Helen Keller able to overcome her disabilities?